The wind howls across the black volcanic plain. Snow drives sideways, burying everything that doesn't move. In Iceland, winter doesn't arrive. It descends like a shroud, blotting out the sun for months. Temperatures plunge below freezing. Storms roll in from the North Atlantic with gale-force winds that can flatten a standing man. And in the 9th century, when Norse settlers first arrived on these shores, they faced a problem that would test every ounce of their ingenuity. How do you build a house when there are no trees? The Vikings who crossed the ocean from Scandinavia were accustomed to timber halls, long rectangular buildings with vertical wooden walls and steep shingled roofs. They knew how to work oak and pine, how to split logs into planks, how to raise a frame that could bear the weight of snow. But when they stepped onto the beaches of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, they found landscapes almost entirely devoid of forest. Only scattered birch scrub clung to the hillsides. No oak, no pine, just rock, grass, and peat stretching to the horizon. The question wasn't merely architectural, it was existential. Winter in the North Atlantic doesn't forgive mistakes. A poorly insulated dwelling means frostbite, hypothermia, death. Fuel is scarce. Daylight vanishes. The earth itself freezes solid. So the Norse settlers did something counterintuitive, something that would come to define their survival in these harsh lands. They stopped fighting the environment and started building with it. They turned the frozen ground into walls. They roofed their homes with grass. They dug their dwellings into the earth itself, creating structures so deeply integrated with the landscape that from a distance they looked like grassy hillsides with doors. These were turf houses, longhouses with walls made from blocks of peat and sod, thick enough to trap body heat, durable enough to stand for generations. And they worked. Inside these earth-covered halls, families endured months of darkness and cold, keeping warm with nothing more than a single open fire and the insulating power of the surrounding soil. This is the story of how Vikings engineered survival in one of the most unforgiving climates on Earth, using the very elements that threatened to kill them. The first challenge was material. In mainland Scandinavia, timber was abundant. A Norse chieftain could fell a dozen oaks and raise a hall in weeks. But in Iceland, only about 30% of the island supported even minimal birch woodland, and those trees were small, nothing like the towering pines of Norway. Archaeological surveys confirm that early settlers faced a timber famine almost immediately. Good structural wood simply didn't exist. What they did have was turf. Beneath the thin layer of grass that covered the island lay thick deposits of peat, partially decomposed plant matter, compact and dense. This peat could be cut into blocks, like bricks, and stacked. The blocks were light enough to carry but heavy enough to stay put once positioned. And crucially, peat had a property that wood lacked. It was an extraordinary insulator. The cellular structure of decomposed plant fibers trapped air in countless tiny pockets, creating a natural barrier against cold. A wall of turf 1 meter thick could hold heat inside far better than a wooden wall of any thickness. So the Norse began cutting. They sliced rectangular sods from the hillsides, each block roughly the size of a loaf of bread, roots still tangled through the grass on top. These turfs were stacked in a herringbone pattern, each layer angled slightly so that the weight pressed inward rather than outward, preventing collapse. Walls rose slowly, block by block, until they stood 1 to 2 meters thick. From the outside, these walls looked alive. The grass on top kept growing, roots knit the blocks together. In summer, wildflowers bloomed on the roof. The house became indistinguishable from the land itself. But turf alone couldn't support a roof. For that, the Norse needed timber, and timber was the most precious resource in their new world. They couldn't afford to waste it on walls or floors. Every beam had to count. So they turned to the ocean. Arctic currents are a fascinating and powerful phenomenon. Rivers in Siberia, the Ob, the Yenisei, the Lena, carry meltwater north through the taiga forests, and with that water come logs. Trees felled by storms, eroded banks, and spring floods. These logs drift into the Arctic Ocean, where they become locked in sea ice. The ice moves. Slowly, over months or years, it drifts westward across the top of the world, carried by currents that circle the pole. Some of it melts off the coast of Greenland. Some continue south past Iceland. And when it finally breaks apart in warmer waters, the logs it carried are released. To the Norse, this was providence. Driftwood washed up on Icelandic beaches in quantities that varied wildly from year to year, but when it arrived, it was treated like treasure. Coastal landowners had legal rights to any timber that came ashore on their property. Men would haul the logs inland, dry them, and split them carefully. A single good beam could frame a doorway. A handful of posts could support a roof. The wood didn't need to bear the weight of the walls. The turf did that. It only needed to hold up the roof and provide a skeleton for the structure. Archaeological excavations of early Norse houses reveal that builders used large, unsplit logs when driftwood was abundant. However, as supplies dwindled over time, they adapted. Later generations split logs lengthwise, making two beams from one. They recycled timber from abandoned buildings. They imported small amounts from Norway at great expense. Every scrap was saved, reused, and passed down through families. In a world where most building materials were renewable, you could always cut more turf. Wood stood alone as irreplaceable. The construction process itself was systematic and labor-intensive. First, builders chose a site, often on a slope to aid drainage. They leveled the ground and laid a foundation course of flat stones. These stones served two purposes. They prevented the turf walls from sitting directly on damp soil, which would cause rot, and they provided a stable base that could bear the immense weight of the earthen structure. In Greenland, even churches used this method. Stone footings topped with turf walls that could be over 1.5 meters thick. Once the foundation was in place, the wooden frame went up. Vertical posts were sunk into the ground or set on stone pads. Cross beams connected them. A ridge pole ran the length of the building, creating the spine of the roof. This frame was minimal, just enough to hold the structure's shape. Then the turf work began. Builders stacked sod blocks around the frame, angling them inward at roughly 45 degrees. The walls rose slowly, each course laid tight against the one below. At full height, the walls could be nearly 2 meters thick at the base, tapering slightly as they climbed. The roof was next. Rafters of driftwood were laid across the ridgepole, and over these went more turf, layer after layer, until the entire structure was covered. From above, the house looked like a long green mound with a door at one end. Snow would pile on top in winter, adding another layer of insulation. Rain would soak into the turf and drain away through the grass roots. The house breathed. It settled. It became part of the hillside. Most Norse turf houses followed a rectangular plan. Longhouses, they're called, and the name is literal. Lengths varied from 12 meters to over 20, widths from 4 to 6. The main room, the hall or skalli, was the heart of the home. This was where the family lived, ate, worked, and slept. At the center of the hall was the hearth. The hearth was not a fireplace in the modern sense. It was a pit dug into the floor, lined with stones, filled with burning peat or driftwood. There was no chimney. Smoke rose toward the roof, where it escaped through a hole, a vent called a lower in Old Norse. This hole was small, just large enough to let smoke out without letting too much heat escape. On windless days, smoke hung thick inside the hall, stinging eyes, blackening the turf walls and wooden beams. Managing the fire was a constant task. Someone had to tend it, feeding fuel, adjusting the smoke hole, keeping the coals alive through the night. But that fire, small as it was, made life possible. The physics of the turf house worked like this. Heat from the hearth radiated outward in all directions. In a typical wooden building, much of that heat would escape through the walls and roof. But in a turf house, the thick earthen walls absorbed the heat and held it. Turf has high thermal mass. It takes a long time to warm up, but once warm, it releases heat slowly. The walls became warm to the touch. The air inside, trapped by the low ceiling and minimal openings, stayed warm even when the fire burned low. Body heat from the inhabitants added to the warmth. So did the breath of the family, the steam from cooking, the ambient heat of daily life. All of it accumulated inside that earthen shell. The result was a microclimate. Outside, the temperature might be 20 degrees below freezing. Winds might be howling at 40 miles per hour. But inside, nestled beneath 2 meters of turf, the air could be warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. Excavation reports from Greenland and Iceland suggest that interior temperatures in well-maintained turf houses could be tens of degrees warmer than the air outside. The house functioned as a thermal battery, storing heat during the day and releasing it at night, buffering the inhabitants from the wild swings of the Arctic climate. The layout of the house reinforced this efficiency. Along the sides of the hall, builders constructed low benches from wood or stone. These benches served as seats during the day and beds at night. Family members slept side by side, sometimes with animal hides or woven mats for padding. Guests and hired laborers might sleep there too. Everyone clustered around the fire. This wasn't just tradition, it was survival. The closer you were to the hearth, the warmer you stayed. Spreading out would waste heat. So the architecture enforced communal living, physically arranging people in the most thermally efficient configuration possible. In some houses, additional rooms were attached. A byre for cattle or sheep might adjoin the main hall, separated by a partition wall, but sharing the same roof. Animal body heat, like human body heat, added warmth. The Vikings understood this. They didn't heat the barn. They let the barn heat the house. In wealthier households, there might be a separate kitchen or storage room, but these were secondary spaces. The hall and its hearth were the center of everything. Lowering the floor was another trick. Many turf houses were partially sunken, dug into the ground, so that the floor level sat below the surrounding terrain. This semi-subterranean design reduced exposure to wind and tapped into the earth's natural insulation. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round. By sinking the house into this zone, builders ensured that the floor itself wasn't radiating cold upward. The earth banked around the walls provided an additional thermal buffer. Wind couldn't scour the walls directly. Snow would drift over the roof, but the walls stayed protected. The house, in effect, hid from the weather. But this strategy wasn't unique to the Norse. Across the Arctic, other cultures arrived at the same solution. In Labrador, Inuit families built winter houses from blocks of mossy turf, with wooden frames and central hearths, sheltering communal groups through the coldest months. In Alaska, the Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, constructed pit houses using driftwood and whalebone frames covered in turf. Some of these structures are over 3,000 years old, and they look remarkably similar to Norse turf houses. Rectangular plans, thick earthen walls, low entrances, and central fire pits. The physics don't change with culture. Cold is cold. Earth insulates. Fire warms. Humans everywhere figured this out. Even in Scotland, where Norse settlers established communities in the Orkney and Hebrides Islands, turf became the standard building material. Excavations at sites like Bro of Bersay reveal 10th and 11th century Norse hall houses with stone and turf walls stretching over 20 meters in length. These had central hearths, earthen floors, and the same semi-subterranean layout as their Icelandic counterparts. The technique spread wherever the Norse went, adapted to local conditions but fundamentally unchanged. But turf houses required maintenance. Sod rots, grass dies, rain erodes. Every few years, the outer layer of turf had to be replaced, new blocks cut and stacked over the old. Roofs especially needed attention. Water pooling on the roof could seep through, soaking the interior. So the roof had to be returfed regularly. The grass kept trimmed, drainage channels cleared. The house was a living thing, demanding care. Neglect it, and it would collapse back into the hillside. This constant renewal meant that turf houses rarely lasted more than a generation or two without major repairs. Yet the footprint endured. When a house fell into disrepair, a new one might be built on the same foundation, using the same stone base, the same floor plan. Over centuries, layers of occupation accumulated. Archaeologists excavating Norse sites often find multiple phases of construction. Old walls buried beneath new ones. Hearths rebuilt atop older hearths. Floors raised as debris and ash piled up. The house became a palimpsest, each generation writing over the last. Social structure shaped the house, and the house shaped social life. In medieval Europe, architecture screamed status. Kings lived in stone castles. Nobles had timber manors. Peasants made do with wattle and daub. But in Iceland, this hierarchy collapsed. Everyone, chieftain, farmer, laborer, lived in turf. The environment was the great equalizer. You couldn't build a stone castle when there were no quarries. You couldn't raise a timber hall when there were no forests. So even the wealthiest families lived under sod roofs. Status, when it was displayed, happened inside. A rich chieftain might line his hall with finely carved wooden panels, imported at great cost. He might have a house within a house, a small timber structure built inside the larger turf shell, warmer and more prestigious. But from the outside, his home looked the same as a poor farmer's, a grassy mound with a door. This architectural uniformity was unusual for the time and reflected the harsh realities of life in the North Atlantic. Nature didn't care about rank. Cold didn't discriminate. Survival depended on the same strategies for everyone. Yet the hall was more than shelter. It was the center of family identity, the place where lineage was traced and honor maintained. Sagas written centuries later still remember the halls of famous chieftains. Njal's Hall at Bergtorsvoll, Egil's Hall at Borg. These weren't grand palaces, but they were meaningful. The hearth was where oaths were sworn, where disputes were settled, where stories were told on long winter nights. The fire was witness to everything. Religious life, too, centered on the hearth. Before Christianity arrived in the late 10th century, Norse families practiced a form of paganism that involved household rituals. The head of the household, sometimes a godai, a chieftain priest, would make offerings to gods and spirits at the family altar, which was often near the hearth. The fire itself had symbolic weight. It was life, warmth, light. To let the fire go out was to court disaster. After conversion to Christianity, much of this symbolism transferred to the new faith. Small turf churches were built, using the same construction methods as houses. These churches were low, rectangular, sod-roofed, indistinguishable from secular buildings, except for a cross marking the entrance. Inside, a small hearth still provided warmth during services. The architecture didn't change, only the rituals performed within it. Some scholars argue that the layout of Norse halls carried cosmological meaning. The orientation of the building, the placement of the hearth, the division of space, all might have reflected Norse beliefs about the structure of the universe. North and south could represent different realms, the world of the living versus the world of the dead, or the human realm versus the supernatural. East and west might correspond to masculine and feminine domains, or day and night. This is speculative, based on later interpretations of saga references and ethnographic parallels, but it suggests that the turf house was more than a functional object. It was a symbolic space, embedding the family's place in the cosmos. The decline of turf houses came slowly. As Iceland and Greenland integrated into European trade networks, imported timber became more accessible. By the late Middle Ages, some wealthy families began building hybrid structures, stone foundations, timber frames, but still turf-clad for insulation. In Greenland, the Norse settlements eventually failed entirely, abandoned by the 15th century as climate conditions worsened and supply lines from Europe frayed. The turf houses there stood empty, slowly collapsing back into the earth. In Iceland, turf construction persisted much longer. Well into the 19th century, rural Icelandic farms were still building with sod. The method worked. It was cheap, effective, and suited to the landscape. Only with the advent of modern materials, concrete, steel, industrial lumber, did turf finally fall out of use. Today, a handful of preserved turf houses remain, maintained as museums. Glaumberg, Laufás, and a few others stand as reminders of a time when Icelanders built their homes from the ground up. Modern architects have rediscovered the principles behind turf houses. Earth-sheltered buildings, green roofs, passive solar design, all borrow from the same logic that guided Norse builders 1,000 years ago. Soil insulates. Thermal mass stabilizes temperature. Minimizing surface area reduces heat loss. These aren't new ideas. They're ancient ones, refined by necessity in the harshest climates on Earth. The turf house stands as a testament to human adaptability. Faced with an environment that offered almost nothing, no timber, no stone suitable for large structures, no metal, no surplus of anything, the Norse made do. They turned grass into walls. They harnessed ocean currents to deliver timber from forests they would never see. They dug into the frozen ground and made it a shelter for themselves. And in doing so, they managed to survive. Not just survived, they thrived. They raised families, built communities, composed sagas, and explored new lands. The ingenuity wasn't in grand innovation. It was in attention to detail, in understanding how heat moves, how water drains, how wind scours, how fire consumes. It involved stacking 10,000 turf blocks to form a wall, in the careful splitting of a single log to make 2 beams, in the endless tending of a hearth that couldn't be allowed to go cold. The turf house was a machine for living, designed not by engineers, but by farmers, fishermen, and families who had no choice but to get it right. Centuries have passed since the last Norse family huddled around a peat fire in a sod-roofed hall. But the lesson endures that survival isn't about conquering the environment. It's about understanding, working with, and transforming its raw materials into solutions. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of importing what they needed. They had to use what was there: soil, grass, driftwood, stone, and from those humble materials, they built homes that lasted for generations, sheltering entire families through winters that would have been fatal to anyone less resourceful. In the end, the turf house was more than architecture. It was a philosophy. It said that no environment is too harsh, no resource too scarce, if you're willing to think differently. It said that the ground beneath your feet, the grass you walk on, the very soil you're standing on, these can be transformed into shelter, warmth, and safety. It's a reminder, carved into 1,000 grassy hillsides across the North Atlantic, that human ingenuity doesn't always look like soaring towers or gleaming steel. Sometimes it appears as a mound of earth with a door, quiet and unassuming, yet warm inside when the world outside is frozen solid.